A French inventor filed a patent in 1925 for a device that tripled crop yields. No chemicals, no machines, just copper and zinc pulling energy from the sky and the soil. A British government committee spent nearly 2 decades reviewing the results. In 1936, the same year synthetic fertilizer swept across Europe, they stamped every report, not for publication, and sealed them in a vault. The devices disappeared. The name was erased from the journals. The patent survived. The physics never changed. And right now, in the soil beneath every plant you own, the same reaction is still running. Here's the question. Was this buried because it failed, or because it worked too well for an industry that needed you to keep buying? That's the investigation. How a working technology got a bad reputation. Search electroculture or copper coil gardening online. What you find is a predictable pattern, a handful of documented results on one side and a wall of dismissal on the other. Pseudoscience. Debunked. No peer-reviewed evidence. The dismissal follows a structure that should be familiar. The method gets described in the vaguest possible terms. Someone replicates it carelessly with random wire and no controls. Nothing measurable happens. The conclusion: it doesn't work. But here is the precise problem. The effect depends on specific materials, specific geometry, and specific orientation. A copper coil placed randomly is not the same as one oriented to magnetic north, with the correct gauge wire and an open gap in the loop. The difference between a working setup and a failed replication is the difference between a correctly assembled radio antenna and a ball of tin foil. Both are metal. Only one receives a signal. This is how a technology gets buried without a controlled refutation. Not through a study that tested it properly and found it deficient. Through accumulated bad replications, each one reinforcing the wrong conclusion, and each one spreading faster than the original documented results. The original results are specific and traceable. In 1925, a French farmer and inventor named Justin Christofleau filed Swiss patent CH11018648A, the electromagnetic terrestrial celestial apparatus. The document described a system of copper and zinc plates designed to capture atmospheric electricity and channel it into the root zone. Christofleau wasn't filing theory. He had spent decades testing in his own fields. He published yield tables in agricultural journals and invited scrutiny from anyone willing to visit his experimental gardens. His numbers were specific: oat fields producing 200% more grain than control plots. Potatoes yielding 30 to 35 tubers per plant where farmers expected 5 or 6. By the late 1930s, over 150,000 units had been sold across Europe. Factories in France and Belgium ran at capacity. Testimonials flooded in from growers whose fields had, by their accounts, never looked better. Then the trail goes cold. Christofleau's name disappeared from agricultural journals. The devices were packed away in barns. The patents remained on file in Switzerland. The physics hadn't changed, but the conversation had, and understanding why requires going back to 1936. The committee, the vault, and the timing. In 1918, the British Ministry of Agriculture established the British Electroculture Committee, not a fringe organization. Physicists, biologists, electrical engineers, Nobel laureates. Their mandate was to determine whether electricity could transform agriculture, and their findings, gathered over nearly 2 decades of field trials, were stamped not for publication and sealed in government archives. Only 2 copies are known to have survived. The committee ran controlled trials across fields and greenhouses, documenting the effects of copper and zinc plates, atmospheric antennas, and galvanic soil currents on crop yields. Their interim reports described results that couldn't be explained by conventional soil science: wheat sprouting faster, root crops bulking up, yield margins that exceeded what weather or seed selection could account for. These were not backyard tinkerers. They were fellows of the Royal Society, reporting to the Ministry of Agriculture, with the institutional weight to turn a laboratory finding into national agricultural policy. In 1936, the committee was dissolved without public explanation. That year, the Haber-Bosch process was sweeping across European agriculture. Factories once used to manufacture wartime explosives were converting their infrastructure to produce synthetic nitrogen fertilizer at industrial scale. The price of ammonia collapsed from $100 a ton to under $30. Bags of white crystals promised record harvests with simple annual application. The business model was built on the calendar. Buy fertilizer every spring or risk a smaller harvest. A method that required a one-time installation of copper and zinc wire and then ran permanently on atmospheric electricity had no place in that economy. No secret memo has surfaced proving a deliberate suppression campaign. The record shows something more structural, a market that rewarded the disposable and made the durable invisible. Research funding followed profit motive. Academic journals closed their doors to manuscripts on electroculture. University researchers, wary of ridicule and dependent on grant funding from agrochemical-aligned institutions, steered clear. The British Electroculture Committee's findings weren't refuted, they were filed. Academic citations for electroculture research dropped over 90% in the decades following 1936, the same decades when synthetic fertilizer revenue broke records year after year. Two curves, one rising, one collapsing. The same window of time. If you've never heard of the British Electroculture Committee, hit the like. That's exactly what this channel is here to investigate. What is actually happening in the soil and the air? Every patch of open ground sits beneath an invisible electrical field. The atmosphere maintains a steady charge gradient, positive at altitude, negative at ground level. On a clear day, the voltage difference between sky and earth measures approximately 100 volts per meter of elevation. This is not lightning. It is a continuous silent potential difference that never stops. Plants stand directly in the middle of this field. Their leaves and stems, covered in microscopic hairs and wax, act as natural conductors. Roots buried in the earth connect to the negative pole of this natural battery. Every living plant is already an antenna bridging sky and soil. A copper wire, far more conductive than a plant stem, intercepts this gradient more efficiently. Planted in the ground and oriented correctly, it channels atmospheric charge directly into the root zone. The effect isn't imported from outside, it amplifies what is already there. Inside the plant, the mechanism becomes biological. Plant cells transmit electrical signals called action potentials, voltage pulses that travel through tissues and trigger responses in growth, photosynthesis, and stress resistance. When a tomato leaf is damaged, an electrical wave travels down the stem, activating defense responses in distant cells. This is documented plant physiology, a living circuit. When an external electrical gradient is introduced, from atmospheric capture, or from galvanic metals buried in the soil, these internal signals respond. Studies show that plants exposed to low-level electrical fields increase antioxidant production, activate growth-related genes, and develop stronger, denser root systems. The effect is not dramatic at the cellular level, but compounded across an entire growing season. The changes accumulate. The galvanic mechanism is simpler and more directly measurable. When copper and zinc are buried in moist soil, they produce a galvanic cell, the same electrochemical reaction that powers any battery. Zinc, the more reactive metal, sheds electrons toward the copper. The moist soil carries dissolved mineral ions between the two metals, completing the circuit. The voltage produced in optimal conditions, 0.8 to 1.1 volts, measurable with a basic multimeter, consistent across trials. At the microscopic level, this current breaks apart chemical bonds in the soil. Nutrients locked as stable compounds, phosphates, calcium, potassium, shift into forms more accessible to plant roots. The process is electrolysis, and it converts a sealed nutrient pantry into an open one. Roots respond to this voltage directly. Decades of plant physiology research have documented electrotropism. Roots actively grow toward the cathode, the copper plate, in response to even weak electrical gradients. Lab experiments confirm root detection of fields as low as 1 millivolt per centimeter. In a garden setup producing 0.8 to 1.1 volts, the roots are not just passively absorbing, they are navigating toward the highest nutrient availability in the bed. And as the zinc corrodes, it releases zinc ions into the surrounding soil. Plants require zinc to synthesize tryptophan, the amino acid that drives auxin production. Auxin is the master growth hormone, governing stem elongation, fruit development, and root branching. Without adequate zinc, this pathway stalls. With a slow, continuous supply delivered directly to the root zone by a corroding electrode, it runs at full capacity. The Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences tested a scaled version of this principle across 3,600 hectares, an area larger than 6,000 football fields, using high-voltage wires suspended above crops to replicate atmospheric electrical stimulation. Yields climbed nearly 30%. Pesticide use dropped by as much as 70 to 100% in some trial segments. Farmers reported fewer pests and healthier plants in regions where chemical controls had previously been considered essential. These numbers were published in institutional research. They were not retracted. They are not widely discussed. The experiment the committee never ran at scale. The British Electroculture Committee had the institutional infrastructure to test this as a combined, controlled system. They didn't, or if they did, the results were sealed. Here is what that experiment looks like at the scale anyone can run. For the galvanic component, use a length of copper pipe, -6 to 8 inches, and a galvanized nail or zinc strip of the same length. These are the two metals, no substitutes. Copper and zinc create the galvanic cell. Other metals won't produce the same voltage gradient or the same zinc ion release. Push the copper into the soil on one side of the plant's root zone, approximately 6 inches deep. Place the zinc nail on the opposite side at matching depth, 8 to 12 inches apart. Connect them above ground with stainless steel wire, not copper wire, which creates a short circuit and eliminates the voltage gradient. Verify the setup with a multimeter, one probe to copper, one to zinc. The reading should be between 4.8 and 1.1 volts. Moist, slightly acidic soil produces the strongest signal. If the reading drops below 0.5 volts, check soil moisture. If the zinc shows heavy corrosion, replace it. 1 pair per plant. Excess zinc accumulates in the soil and stresses roots. For the atmospheric coil, use 14-gauge bare copper wire formed into a loose spiral of 3 to 5 turns, 5 to 20 centimeters in diameter. The coil must have an open gap, never close the loop. The open circuit allows the coil to function as an antenna rather than a conductor. A closed loop short-circuits the atmospheric capture. Orient the top of the coil to magnetic north. Use a compass. This is the step most failed replications skip. The Earth's telluric currents flow north to south. Misorientation reduces the effect to near zero. Drive the coil 10 to 15 centimeters into the soil. Position 10 to 20 centimeters from the plant base. The component that generates real data is the control. Plant an identical species in identical soil with identical water and light conditions, with no copper, no zinc, and no coil. Measure both setups every 2 weeks with a refractometer. Readings from leaf juice measure dissolved sugars and plant health directly. Track plant height, leaf size, and pest activity. Weigh the harvest. The Electroculture Committee ran versions of this comparison for nearly 20 years. The data they gathered filled reports that were stamped and sealed. The methodology wasn't wrong. The results were inconvenient. Document every reading. This is how the evidence base gets rebuilt, not in institutions where funding follows product sales, but in gardens where the experiment costs less than a bag of fertilizer. Subscribe if you want to follow this experiment as we run it with documented controls. The data will be public. You should be there when it comes in. Where the real disagreement sits and what it reveals. The mechanism is not the disputed part. Galvanic electrochemistry is first semester physics. Electrotropism in plant roots is documented in peer-reviewed plant biology journals. The atmospheric potential gradient is measurable with basic instruments. The zinc-auxin growth pathway is established biochemistry. The dispute is about scale and attribution, and the framing of that dispute reveals the structural bias underneath it. The official position: electroculture lacks the robust peer-reviewed data required for agricultural endorsement. The method is unproven at commercial scale. Growers should rely on validated inputs. The precise problem with that position: robust peer-reviewed data requires funding. Funding follows commercial incentive. A method that uses one-time installations of copper wire, materials that cannot be patented, branded, or sold on a subscription, generates no commercial incentive. The research doesn't get funded not because the mechanism is implausible, but because there is no financial structure to support its investigation. The global fertilizer industry generates over $200 billion in annual revenue. The pesticide market adds another $60 billion. Both markets depend on annual depletion. The customer returns every season because the product runs out. A permanent copper installation that enhances soil conductivity and releases a slow supply of zinc ions for years does not fit that model. The British Electroculture Committee's work had no commercial sponsor. It was government-funded, government-sealed, and government-dissolved. The timing, 1936, the peak of the Haber-Bosch industrial rollout, is documented in the record. Whether the seal was deliberate suppression or institutional inertia doesn't change the outcome. The data was locked away, the committee disbanded, and the research agenda shifted permanently toward inputs that required annual purchase. Philip Callahan, a USDA entomologist, spent decades documenting what he called the soil antenna effect, the measurable difference in electromagnetic properties between fertile volcanic soils and depleted chemical-treated farmland. Fertile soils scored above 1,000 CGS units in magnetic susceptibility. Exhausted farmland barely registered 50. He published over 100 scientific papers connecting paramagnetic soil properties to plant health, pest resistance, and crop yield. His work received no significant funding for scale trials. His findings appeared in agricultural extension bulletins, labeled unproven, and not recommended for commercial growers. Callahan worked within the USDA. His findings were not published by a fringe journal. They were produced inside an institution whose other departments were simultaneously endorsing and promoting the same chemical inputs his research called into question. The record doesn't require a conspiracy. It requires only a structural alignment of incentives. Research that threatens recurring revenue doesn't get funded. Research that supports it does. The result, over decades, is a scientific literature that has been shaped not just by what is true, but by what is profitable to investigate, what has been established, and what nobody has tested. Here is the honest accounting. The galvanic reaction between copper and zinc in moist soil is real, measurable, and produces the voltage range documented across trials. Electrotropism is documented in plant biology. The zinc-auxin growth pathway is established biochemistry. Philip Callahan's paramagnetic soil measurements are reproducible with standard instruments. The Chinese Academy trial across 3,600 hectares produced a 30% yield increase and published the data. The British Electroculture Committee ran controlled trials for nearly 20 years, filed documented results, and was dissolved the same year synthetic fertilizer became the dominant agricultural model. What has not been established? A large-scale, long-duration, independently funded controlled trial of the combined system, galvanic metals, atmospheric coils, and paramagnetic soil amendment, run with the same methodological rigor applied to synthetic fertilizer comparisons. That trial has not been run. The funding to run it has not materialized. The institutions that fund agricultural research at scale are structurally aligned with the inputs the trial would compare against. The patents are still on file. Swiss patent CH1118648A, British patent 8763. The physics hasn't changed since Alexander Bain buried copper and zinc in the ground in 1841 and powered an electric clock for months. The atmospheric potential gradient still runs at 100 volts per meter. The bacteria in your soil are still producing electrons right now. The copper in your garden bed is still waiting to complete a circuit that the British Electroculture Committee documented, validated, and sealed. The question the data cannot yet fully answer, and that no publicly funded institution has yet fully answered, is how much of what the Electroculture Committee found is practically scalable, how reliably it replicates across soil types and climates, and what yield gains are achievable when all components are combined rather than tested in isolation. That question is still open. The experiment costs less than a bag of fertilizer. The instructions are in this video. The controls are simple. The documentation is just a notebook. The best way to unbury forgotten science is to plant it in every garden on the street. One word in the comments. Which part of this investigation surprised you most? The committee, the patent, or the physics? One word. I'm tracking the answers.